October. That's a Monday, the 12th.
Oh, that's quite soon.
Yeah, it is, yeah. 14th.
So what's your... We haven't.
Duval, Berry, for whom Assemblymember Russell has kindly offered to attend, and a late apologies from Assemblymember Desai, who is unfortunately ill and therefore hasn't been able to get a substitute. There are no other chairman's announcements. Declarations of interests. Can I ask members to note the list of declarations on the agenda and ask if there are any additional declarations you wish to make?
No.
Thank you. Item 3 is the minutes of the previous meeting. Can we confirm the minutes on the 11th of July are correct and can be signed by me as a true record?
Agreed.
Thank you. Item 4 is the summary list of actions. Can we note the outstanding actions on the agenda?
Noted.
Thank you. Item 5, which is the main item of business for today, which is focusing in on housing. So I'd like to welcome our guests. So Rickardo Hyatt, who is the Interim Executive Director for Housing and Land at the GLA, accompanied by Francesca Lewis, who's the Housing Policy Manager at the GLA. From outside the GLA, we have Helen Evans, who's the Chair of G15, and Keith Scanlon, who's Assistant Professor. Kath, I beg your pardon. Another problem for today, we've got the briefing note wrong. I beg your pardon, Kath. Kath Scanlon, who's the Assistant Professional Research Fellow at the London School of Economics, and Ian Mulheirn, who is Executive Director of the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Can I thank all of you for your attendance today and for the contributions that you're about to make. Now, the opening question is normally along the lines of a scene setter, and I'm going to put it first to the non-GLA participants in the meeting today. Housing affordability is a multifaceted thing. There is no one definition of it, and there is no one solution to it either. So I think I'll probably start on this side with Ian. What would you believe is the best way of defining housing affordability?
I guess there's two kind of main definitions that we might think about. One is the affordability of purchase, and the other is affordability of day-to-day housing costs, and notably rent. And I think the important thing to note about that is that the affordability of those two things can move independently of one another according to how different policies change. So you can have house prices rising but rents falling, or the opposite, and so you often need different policies to tackle those two different affordability challenges.
Okay, Kath?
If you look across various developed countries, the general rule of thumb is that households shouldn't spend more than about a third of their income on housing costs, whether they're renting or purchasing their homes. In some places, in more expensive cities, the benchmark is moved up to about 40%. And depending on the structure of the housing market, sometimes utilities are included in that sum because, for example, in Eastern Europe, rents are very low, but heating costs are very high. So that across the world seems to be a kind of generally accepted norm, that 35% is about the right amount. Now, then you have a second question, which is what kind of housing are you getting for that? Is that adequate for the household and so on? But that's generally the way it's measured.
Okay. And finally, Helen?
I should say, start with the G15 doesn't have a position on this, so these are kind of my observations based on what we do. I think it's quite difficult to reduce it to a number. I'm familiar with the third of disposable income definition. I also reference the Joseph Rowntree Foundation says that having 2/3 of the average income in an area is what you need to avoid poverty, including housing costs, so that's another numerical way of coming at it. But actually there's lots of different things involved here. There's, you know, affordability in absolute terms, just to access somewhere to live. Then there's affordability in relation to aspiration. There's affordability in relation to reasonableness of the housing that you're hoping to occupy. So, you know, in terms of location, size, situation, suitability. And so I think trying to reduce it to a sort of numerical formula is actually quite difficult, and I think the G15's position would be that we try and address a wide range of different types of housing need and different kinds of affordability pressures.
Okay. Rickardo, bringing you in, what do you think are the most acute housing affordability problems, and for whom?
So, from my perspective, those in most need of affordable housing are those who are deemed to be most vulnerable in London. Those who generally would qualify through council housing waiting lists for sort of social rented, general needs rented housing. Now, you know, colleagues on the panel here have discussed, you know, the various metrics in assessing affordability, but I think sometimes it's challenging to look at, given the number of local authorities that we have in London, to not look at London as a region. So from my perspective, in terms of those who are most in need of housing, we have certainly geared our housing strategy towards those who would otherwise struggle to be able to afford to rent privately, and those at the higher end who are caught between the criteria of being able to access housing through a council or a general needs rented via a housing association, and those who are unable to buy privately. So there's those who are squeezed in the middle. So, you know, we through our program provide for a range of needs.
Okay. To the rest of the guests then, I don't know if anyone else wants to have a punt on this as well. I mean, what you think is the most acute housing affordability problem, and for whom? Any particular areas?
I think you have to, you know, supporting what Rickardo said, you have to look at the occupation of temporary accommodation in London, the calls on local authorities to discharge their statutory obligation to homeless people, people who are squeezed by the benefit system as it's currently organised. I think you'd have to say that is the most acute area of need. Having said which, that doesn't mean to say that the other areas of need don't also have to be addressed and considered. You know, and in terms of the use of the public pound, you have to consider whether if you orientate every resource towards that group, the sort of group in absolute need, whether that actually delivers the best outcome more generally for the whole community.
Any dissent to that? General agreement?
Yeah, I broadly agree with that. I mean, I think the thing to recognise is that in terms of cost of renting, for lower income households, the critical determinant of their affordability is really public policy. It's the generosity of local housing allowance. It's it's the availability of social housing and those kind of things. These things are the critical movers in determining affordability. So if there's a squeeze on those policies, then unaffordability will rise, regardless of what's happening in the market.
What about private renting in London? Because we hear all the time that private rents are becoming increasingly unaffordable, and there are, I think there's a division of opinion as to why that is, and you've actually written a very interesting article that says it's not all about supply, which I imagine has got contrasting views across the panel. Do you want to outline some of that?
Yeah, sure. So I think in the debate there's often a confusion when we talk about what's happening to rents about what we really mean. Now, rent levels, I think it's fair to say, have been rising in raw terms. But the reasons for that are kind of twofold. One is that we've seen increasingly more expensive properties coming into the private rented sector, particularly in London, which pushes up the raw average rent, but it doesn't change the rent on a given house. The second thing that's been happening over many years, obviously since the early 80s, is that we've seen a reduction in the size of the social rented sector, and it's heading towards a fifth of the stock in London. So both of those things mean, so more of those people who would have been in the social rented sector are now in the private rented sector, and by definition that means they're paying a higher rent level. But again, it doesn't mean that the rent on any one private house has been going up. So that's why when you look at the ONS's measure of rent, which is measuring private market rents on a like-for-like basis over time, you see that in London, actually, that's been pretty flat in real terms. It hasn't increased relative to the cost of living over the last 15 years or so. But overall, rent levels have been going up because of these more expensive properties coming into the market and because of a shrinking social rented sector. So that has important implications for why this is a concern and what we can do about it.
Well, I think colleagues are going to dive into that a little bit more deeply later on, so I won't steal their thunder. Coming back to you, Rickardo, the issue of private renters, which we've briefly touched on, should the Mayor's focus be on improving housing affordability for them? Because obviously they're facing significant levels of unaffordability and indeed homelessness.
So, as I'm sure the panel is aware, the Mayor has published throughout the summer his blueprint for reforming the public sector, and linking to that is policy and proposals around rent control. Clearly, at the moment, the Mayor doesn't have the powers to implement those policies, but in increasing the overall supply of housing, affordable and of the tenures, ensuring that those who are in need of a safe home are able to get one. The long-term effect of that, and providing a range of tenures, the long-term effect of that is sufficient housing for all, and effectively linking back to the private rented sector. It's about choice for people. So I won't debate the validity of what the Mayor can and can't do in respect of the private rented sector, but clearly it's a serious issue. There are 2.5 million private renters in London, and something needs to be done, but there needs to be a broader conversation, not just in London but across the country.
Because I had an exchange with the Mayor at the last Mayor's Question Time about rent controls.
Yeah.
You've seen it, obviously.
Yes.
And he said, which I don't think was an unreasonable proposition, that rent controls on its own would not be the solution. It would have to be accompanied by, he didn't say the word exponential, but I'm saying it, increase in supply. And as part of a package, it might be something that could help. Do you agree with that? I suppose you're on a bound to, aren't you?
I wouldn't be prepared to comment on that.
Quite right. What about the rest of the panel who aren't employed by the GLA? Do you agree with that proposal?
I'll say something about that. The mayor's proposals, as I understand them, are not simply to cap rents at existing levels or to regulate the rises of rents within leases, but to reduce rents from their current levels.
Yeah.
And I've done several international studies of rent regulation, and I've never seen that policy anywhere. That would be a level of regulation unseen in any developed country, I think, and would have really dramatic unintended consequences.
Being what?
Landlords would simply decide they were no longer going to rent their properties.
So it would reduce supply.
Oh, yes.
Helen, I think you had your hand.
I mean, slightly different reflection on this. We obviously are not in the, well, largely not in the business of private rented homes. However, we have had subsidy to do discounted market rent homes. And we have a biggish scheme which is being rented at the moment, which was supported with a cheap loan from the GLA. And I can say that the demand for that sub-market rent from people who can't access social housing, will never be able to access social housing, is absolutely overwhelming. And the kind of people who are going into that scheme are typically young working people who otherwise would have to house share and want self-contained accommodation, or who are key workers with a very broad definition, working Londoners. And you know, personally I feel that it's a pretty good use of public subsidy in this sort of context.
Yeah, then we're going to move on to solutions.
I mean, I guess in terms of levels, the level of rents in the market sector, in terms of the supply solution, I think all the evidence is pretty clear that this is not really going to make a meaningful dent in the level of rents. So the pretty standard finding is that if you increase the stock of houses in excess of households by about 1%, then you'll reduce rents by about 2%. So that is implies a kind of almost implausible rates of house building to get a significant dent in market levels of rent. So I think that's a general supply solution. Note that's not about social housing supply. A general supply solution is only a very weak tool for reducing overall rent levels. When it comes to rent controls, I think it's always worth distinguishing between, you know, first and second generation, as they're called, rent controls, which are more about capping levels and maximums, and third generation rent controls, which are about regulating the rate of rise of rents once someone is in a tenure, which stops landlords, for example, hiking the rents to evict people or whatever it might be. So I think it's those, in terms of your view on the acceptability of rent controls and the arguments they usually put forward as to why they're damaging, some of those arguments apply to the first set of rent controls, which are slightly more heavy-handed, but don't apply to third-generation rent controls. So I think it's worth passing out the different effects. And personally, I think those kind of third-generation rent controls would be an unambiguously good move, but it won't change the level of market rents. That's true.
Okay.
Can I just come in, sort of related to rent controls, but ultimately if we go back to looking at availability and affordability, in terms of what's actually driving the increase in the cost of housing, to what extent do you feel that the cost of land has a big factor to play in this?
So in terms of the cost of land has a direct impact on the purchase price of housing, obviously. But it actually doesn't really have very much impact on rents, and this is why rents have been broadly flat in real terms for 15 years. Because the reason why land prices have gone up is because interest rates have gone down, which means that if you buy a plot of land, you'll get a stream of services from that plot of land or from that house from now into the future. And the value of that ownership today gets higher when interest rates are lower. So that means with flat rents, you can get rising house prices just because of low interest rates. So actually, I think that land prices are mainly driven by that cost of capital interest rate phenomenon. But that doesn't have any effect on rents itself. Rents are mainly driven by the number of houses, the number of households, and the incomes of those houses. And that's why housing in London, even in London, the market, the private rented market, the rents there have not really grown in real terms. That doesn't mean affordability hasn't deteriorated. It has, but that's because of government policy, not because of inadequate supply or high land prices.
Can I just add something to that? The other reason for the supply, or the price of land, pressure on the price of land, is that the supply of land in London is constrained by the Greenbelt and by other planning conditions, obviously, but there is a physically limited amount of land, which is not the case everywhere. So that demand pressures push the price of land
Sure.
up.
On the interest rate point, because interest rates being low is great news if you've got a mortgage. So if you're a homeowner, it makes mortgages more affordable. If interest rates were to rise, then your point about land value, notwithstanding the point Kath just made, I understand, but that would make private ownership less affordable, which would probably, I think, and I'm looking for a contradiction, increase the demand in private rentals, would it not?
Well, if you had overnight a sudden rise in the interest rate, in this kind of fictional world, then you almost instantaneously get an adjustment in the price of land because its future value is just reduced, which means that new buyers will be coming into the market and looking at they'd be able to buy cheaper houses. They'd pay higher interest rates for them, so the day-to-day cost of servicing your mortgage probably wouldn't change, but the price would go down, the interest rate would go up, and the two move in opposition to one another. So it shouldn't really change the affordability, day-to-day affordability of purchase for a person with a mortgage.
So you think that the price of housing would drop in response to an increase in interest rates?
You would expect that to happen, yeah. A basic housing economic theory would tell you they will drop if interest rates rise.
Because normal supply and demand theory would dictate that unless you've got a fall off in demand, it wouldn't.
Well, this is really the point. The indicator of this. There's two markets here. One is a market for buying assets, land assets. The other is a market for renting a house on a day-to-day basis. And the flat level of market rents tells us that there hasn't really been a change in the demand for people living in London relative to the supply. That's why rents have stayed stable. So that's where I slightly disagree with Kath. I think if there was evidence that constrained availability of land was responsible for this increase in prices, then we would have seen rising rents, falling market rent affordability, and that's not what we've seen.
Okay. Did you want to respond to that, Kath, or are you content to leave it?
No, I'll leave it.
Okay. Right, Assemblymember Hall.
I was going to come on to renting later, but since we're in that area now, if we can just explore that a little bit more now. Are any of you aware of any examples where rent controls have actually worked?
What's the definition of worked?
As in, delivered what it wants to, more affordability without crushing people and landlords deciding to run.
Well, there are many countries and cities that operate rent control or rent regulation systems of one kind or another. Most of them now are what Ian has correctly described as third-generation rent controls, which means that the level of the initial rent is free, but then within the lease there's you can only raise the rent, say, every 12 or 18 months and only by a certain percentage. So you see that, for example, in Germany. That's the system. And Germany is a country where most of the population rent their homes, and that works well in Germany. It's well understood. Landlords stay in the market. But there are a lot of other things about the German system that are very different. So
yes.
It's hard to say that you could just transfer that here and have the same outcomes. You wouldn't.
Okay. Rickardo, what sort of method of rent controls do you think the Mayor has in mind?
I think you'd have to direct that sort of question outside of what has been published, what the Mayor published back in the summer. I think that question is best directed to the Mayor or James Murray's deputy, unless you want to elaborate further on.
Well, no, I mean, obviously, you're the chap here from the GLA. You're the... I'm trying to read your role, but I would have thought that you would have known, because clearly a lot of modelling has been done on this. Would you like to explain to us the modelling that's been done on this that has persuaded the Mayor to think he needs to be asking for these abilities to do this control?
Well, you know, there is a lot of detailed modelling that has gone on to advise the Mayor's position, but clearly, you know, there's a recommendation that an independent commission is set up to manage and implement the Mayor's proposals. So I think, you know, I can always follow up afterwards with greater detail, but at this moment in time, it's if we want to get into the technicalities of the proposals, I think it's a complex position to be able to explain at this moment in time.
Well, you're surrounded
what's
by
your-
experts. We're not experts, but we're very interested to hear, and I would have thought in your position you'd know if a lot
Yeah.
of detailed modelling has been done,
Yeah.
then give us a flavour.
So,
Nation's policy.
yeah.
Is it okay if I jump in on this one?
Yes, absolutely.
Just to be quite specific about the proposals that were published earlier this summer in the Mayor's blueprint for how he thinks a good private rental sector would work. So the second recommendation was that the Mayor should have the power to control rents. And as part of the research that was undertaken together collaboratively with the New Economics Foundation and Karen Buck, MP, it kind of established a number of different principles of how the Mayor thinks that a private rental sector would work well in future. It was so that was establishing a universal register of landlords. It was establishing a London Private Rent Commission, which would be the body that would have oversight over a future kind of system of rent control. But it was actually kind of silent on the specific method of rent control. So the kind of formula and analysis is something that I think we felt should follow in future, because there's obviously a number of different ways that this can be done. And I think a lot more work is needed to come to a position on what the specific formula that would work well for London would be.
And yet you say a lot of modelling has been done already.
It's research. It's not analytical modelling.
Right, so he's asking for powers without actually knowing specifically what he would be doing. Is that right? Have I got that right?
Well, I think it's a bit in moving away from the point that the Mayor is asking for powers. I think it's about a proposal and the way that the work could be further developed to taking more detailed modelling later on and looking at the technicalities. Setting up an independent commission who could then take that work forward. It's less about, you know, the Mayor requesting the powers, because it's established that he hasn't got the powers at present. But this is a starting point, looking at a direction of travel.
And it recognises that there's a lack of consensus, you know, perhaps even among the experts around this table, of what the exact formula that would work well for rent control should be, which has kind of led to the recommendation of a commission that could retain that oversight and that control in future to establish the right formula for London.
Yeah. And going back to Kath's point, the question earlier about examples of where this had worked, depending on what we mean by has worked. You know, there are variables that are unique to London and to the UK, you know, political will, culture, you know, the different types of housing tenures that are available. So I think there would need to be a bespoke approach, for want of a better term.
And it's not sure, you're not sure what that bespoke view would be as yet?
Well, so you know, reiterating what I said earlier, the proposals are a starting point. You know, further development and further work is required with key stakeholders, with an independent commission as.
Sorry, I thought you
proposed
said
by the
extensive modelling had been done, so I was getting quite excited that we might have some sort of flesh on the bone.
As my colleague clarified, you know, detailed research and different techniques that could be adopted have been explored. But as I said, this is with what has been published, it is a starting point.
Okay. I mean, obviously, some of us are concerned. If you look at what happened in Stockholm, that resulted in a massive loss of properties for rental.
Again, different country.
I'll go on to the official questions. So, to the non-GLA members of the panel, please, what responses to housing unaffordability do you think have got the most potential? So, Helen, shall I start with you?
Well, I mean, you may be aware that the GLA and the G15 have done research and produced a case for considerably increased capital subsidy into affordable housing. And that's recognising the fact that if we want to keep rents low, in the affordable housing sector, there has to be increased capital subsidy at the front end. So if you said typically a new home, a new affordable home in London at the moment might have 20-25% capital subsidy in, we think that it needs nearly 50%, 49%, to produce a sustainable financial model for a reasonable, affordable rented home. So, and I think that that's a consensus view, generally, that capital subsidy needs to rise. It also reflects the fact that the current financing model, which depends on cross-subsidy from sales, has probably reached its limit, not just in relation to the fact that the market is very uncertain at the moment, but because organisations like mine have reached their sort of capacity and they have to have cash in before more cash can go out for new homes. And as I said, I think there's a consensus that capital subsidy actually in the long term is a better way of financing affordable rented homes. I personally believe it will always have an interrelationship with the prevailing welfare system, because that's how you adjust the fairness end of the rent dilemma that we're in. But that's the best way of financing meeting housing need in the short, medium and long term.
Okay, massive cost implications, but I do understand. Kath?
I agree that there's a strong case for more capital subsidy for production of new housing at genuinely low rents for social housing. I also think that more use of public land would be a way of that achieves, that's a de facto subsidy if you release public land at less than market value or even put it in the scheme for free. Intensified development around transport nodes, and personally I would argue for selective release of land in the greenbelt around existing stations. I think those are all things that have potential. None of these things are going to resolve the situation on their own. It's only a package of measures that can make a difference.
So my view would be that in terms of the market cost of housing, there's very little you can actually do. You can release more land, you can supply more, but as I say, the impact will only ever be small, and so there's a limited effectiveness there, and that's because rents are always going to be tied very closely to average incomes in the city, and that is why they will always be expensive. If you try and bear down that a lot, you do end up with adverse consequences for the state and quality of the housing stock and other things, as we've seen in the past in the UK, let alone elsewhere. So I think the key thing to understand, I think, about housing policy is the problems we have with affordability are about the income distribution. They're about the solutions, therefore, are distributional too. And those solutions can come in broadly two forms. You can build more social housing, provide more sub-market rents, so that by definition they're more affordable, or you can directly subsidise private renters through housing benefit. And obviously today a very high proportion of Londoners are in receipt of one or other of those types of subsidy, and so adjusting those is the key and most efficient, most effective way to tackle affordability problems. Personally, I think general market supply is a red herring.
Okay. Do you think the focus on increasing overall supply is the right approach?
I think it has to be part of the approach, certainly. I mean, if you work as we do with local authorities trying to meet the needs of people for whom they're statutorily responsible, they absolutely need access to an increased supply of affordable, socially rented homes. So yes, I think it is part of the approach.
Kath?
Affordability is an essential component of supply, but there has to be new supply, and then the question is what proportion of that supply should be affordable. Mm-hmm. The mayor's target is 50%, and then within that 50%, what's the split between different kinds of affordability? I think there's a strong argument for having it weighted heavily towards the most affordable social housing.
So really just echoing what I said before, I think the the impact of supply in general is minimal and is not a lever that is going to have much effect, nor is it evident that there has been any shortage of places for people to live. The problem is their affordability. And so social housing has slightly confusing attributes, because on the one hand it is extra supply, but on the other hand it's subsidised, and it's the second element of that nature that is important to making housing affordable. It's not the supply bit. That has a very minimal effect. It's the fact that it's just cheaper.
So you think that there is an adequate supply now, it's just not affordable for enough people?
Yeah, that's basically right. I mean, if you look at any measure, whether it's the market, the way economists look at this, the way the ONS looks at this, is it looks at the market cost of housing, and it puts that into its inflation index, and it's saying the market cost of housing in London has broadly moved with inflation over the last 15 years. Meanwhile, incomes have grown. So for the average person in London, that's not the issue, and that's the indicator that says, you know, general supply really isn't the problem here. It's the paring back of the other things that make housing more affordable for people in lower income.
So that's why any increase in supply would have to be underwritten by significant subsidy to bring its affordability down.
Yes. I suppose that's to turn it around. I would say, yes, one solution is social housing, but equally you could just reverse the freezes on housing benefit or the caps on housing benefit, and allow that would have more people in the private rented sector, but you'd be subsidising them more. So there's a central government solution to affordability too. Social housing isn't the only way, but it's one of the levers for making housing more affordable.
Okay, sorry I interrupted you.
No, it's interesting. I mean, if you say supply is fine, and there's more and more subsidies to make it more affordable, surely you'll increase demand, because other people that live outside will think, hang on, I could afford to then go into this with the higher subsidies, and that would increase demand, wouldn't it?
So I guess if you're talking about a London-specific policy,
I am specifically.
then all else equal, that is true. Yes, if you provide more subsidised housing in London, then you would increase the attractiveness of living here, because the people will be able to retain more of their wages. That's definitely true. But it's important to recognise that we are in a world where we have subsidised housing or housing benefits being paid to millions of Londoners already, and that will always be the case. So it's just a question of the degree, and the history we're coming from is one where that support has been pared back over a number of years and decades, in fact. So the question is whether that's a place we want to stay at, and I think it's interesting that in the debate, the effect of the paring back of those policies has been to get everyone talking about supply in general. And in fact, what they should be looking at is what has actually changed. And what has changed is the erosion of the social housing stock and the reduction in financial support for private renters.
I agree with that, but of course if you increase demand because of the higher subsidies, it's going to be a never-ending circle, isn't
it? I don't think there's much evidence that if you increase, say you were to increase housing benefit, I don't think there's much evidence that increases market rents. It's a very hard thing to get a definitive answer on, but generally speaking, the market rents are governed by the supply and demand of homes overall, and the incomes of households in the country or the city. And they don't tend to change much. So when you dial up or dial down housing benefit, that tends not to push up market rents or push down market rents. Hence, we've seen since 2010, when housing benefit's been pared back, that really hasn't had much of an obvious retarding effect on rents. So you might push up demand, but I don't think you're going to see much effect in terms of you'll push up demand for the sub-market housing. I don't think you'll see much impact on the market rents.
So to clarify, the argument you're making is that the level of housing benefit won't really affect the cost of private housing one way or the other.
Yeah, broadly speaking.
But then there's a separate argument about the affordability of increasing housing benefit again, which is slightly to one
Yes.
side and separate.
Yeah. The question about whether, do you mean in terms of from government's perspective?
Yeah, so whether the government flexes housing benefit up or down, it won't make an impact on the affordability of market rents because, as you've said, and you've made the point, that it stayed more or less flat for a period of time. The question would then be whether the government could afford to increase housing benefit.
Yeah.
And then we're back into the argument about austerity and
Exactly.
other things.
Yeah.
But that's a separate argument to the impact of playing around with the level of housing benefit on the affordability of rented housing.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Absolutely.
Okay. Sorry.
Sorry, can I just, so are you saying that if housing benefit were increased, rents would increase commensurately and there would be no benefit to those tenants in receipt of benefit? Or are you saying that rents would stay the same, tenants would have more of their rent paid? So it would, for the tenants in question, it would be more affordable.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm.
So it would unambiguously increase affordability because it wouldn't do much to push up rents, but it would help the people who are in receipt of it. Just in the same way that when these measures of support are cut, the incidence of that cut is on those families. It's not on the market rate of rent and landlords, really.
Question to all of you then, please. Do you think there is a case for going beyond an intervention that focuses on increasing total supply? Rickardo, let's start with you.
Yes. I think as has been reflected by the panel, I think there is a consensus here that increasing housing supply is just one element of what is needed. So, I mean, in simple terms, you know, we need to ensure that, as well as increasing housing supply, that we're delivering the right homes in the right locations, and particularly in a London context, that linking to affordability and need, that all areas of London are delivering their fair share of homes. So, I would close in saying yes, and look, you know, there are probably a myriad of solutions. Looking at the private rented sector, we've talked about, you know, the benefit system and so on, and people being able to access affordable housing, or being homes being made affordable for people renting privately. But yes, you know, there are a number of solutions, not just supply. It's about the right homes, it's about choice. Yeah.
You've said it's about the right homes twice
Right
in your
places,
answer. Yeah. Do you actually think that we're getting the right homes? Because from whenever I look at anything, all I see is 1 or 2 bedroom flats, not family homes at all. So as somebody who knows nothing about this, I would, however, say I don't think the right homes are going in because they're not family homes. What would your response be to that?
So I think it's a nuanced point actually, because yes, you know, there are issues of overcrowding in certain areas in London, and you know, there has always been an ongoing need for not just 1 and 2 bed homes, but also larger 3-bed plus homes. But then if you delve down and, you know, look at the planning process, you know, local authorities who are at the coalface, the front end, who are dealing with those who have the statutory duty to house people, you know, a lot of the onus is on local authorities to ensure that when proposals come forward, you know, those developers, those housing providers are being pushed to provide the homes that are needed locally. But I think if you look at, you know, the last sort of 5 or 10 years or so, look at the last sort of 5 to 10 years, it's clear that there has been a push towards sort of, you know, smaller 1 and 2 bed accommodation. But, you know, there does need to be, you know, a more balanced delivery of homes. But again, you also look at, you know, demographics and the fact that households are becoming smaller, more people are living alone, you know, more people are, you know, purchasing properties or renting properties with friends. So, you know, whilst there is an acute need, and particularly in certain areas, certain boroughs within London for larger homes, there needs to be a broader look. But to answer your question, you know, I do think that we do need more to deliver more larger homes.
Well, I think we absolutely do, and we've been pushing this for a long time. I've often sat on odd housing committees as a sub, and it's been mentioned constantly. I mean, you began by saying it's making sure the right places, the right places are built in the right areas. There is a screaming need for family homes, because if not, if you've only got 1 or 2 bedroom flats, people will move right out, and you can't have Londoners living here with families, and that, I would say, is true of every borough in London.
Absolutely, but then, going back to the arguments Kath was making earlier about land supply, and it becomes a balance between delivering the right homes at the right sizes, but also being as efficient as possible with the land that is available. And it might not be the comfortable or the right answer, but when you're up against it as a local authority or a housing provider to deliver as many homes as possible within constrained sites, most brownfield sites in London are constrained, will contain some element of contamination. They're expensive to bring forward. So there are competing priorities.
Yes, do you not think that the Mayor should be screaming from the rooftops, we need more family homes in London?
Well, we need a variety of homes, of which, delivery of larger family homes is, one part of that solution. And,
yes, but we need a voice saying we need larger family homes, not thousands of 1 and 2 bedroom flats.
I think the strategic housing market assessment, which sits behind the London plan, reflects the current formation of stock in the city, and my understanding of the issue is that there's already a significant number of 3 and 4 beds, which, as others have mentioned, is, as well as being used by families, are currently used by sharing households, many of whom in their 30s, 40s, 50s would perhaps prefer to live alone, or people who would also be better served by downsizing to the type of accommodation that may suit their needs better. So by building a large number of 1 and 2 bedroom homes, the existing stock could be used more efficiently by enabling sharing households to perhaps live by themselves in a home that they can afford for the first time. That's certainly an issue that affects many of my peers. And so, as well as recognising that there's a need for family homes, which I think I would absolutely agree with you, I think we have to recognise the profile of the existing housing stock as well as the new homes that are coming forward. But I would also add that in 2017-18, 25% of the homes started through the Affordable Homes Programme were for 3 or more bedrooms, so the existing interventions are delivering family homes too.
Okay, somebody else wants to...
Yeah, I think it's quite important to understand that the output of organisations like ours tends to reflect the financial model in which we're operating. So whilst we would also want to build as many family homes as we can, and that's definitely what many of the local authorities that we work with need, the financial model has to be self-supporting, and so we're building 1 and 2 bedroom homes for sale in order to cross-subsidise our socially rented homes, and some of those will be larger, but that will always be the smallest number in any scheme, because the most saleable and the most cost efficient to build for sale are generally 2 bedroom flats. And that's also particularly true on high density sites where you're building tall buildings. The appropriateness of putting family homes in tall buildings is debatable, but it's certainly saleable and economically effective to build 1 and 2 bedroom homes and then cross-subsidise a proportion of family homes elsewhere.
Do you think the balance is right? Because what you've described, in a dry economic sense, I completely understand what you've just said. But the trouble is that if 1 and 2 bedroom homes are all that people can afford, people have children, they grow up, they can't afford to move, you're building in long-term social problems by putting people into overcrowded conditions.
I agree with that at a level, but the balance is the result of the financial model. So if you change the financial model, you will change the output. And that probably leads us back to either, much cheaper land in the form of a public subsidy or straightforward capital subsidies into family-sized homes. At the moment, the subsidy regime doesn't really recognise the difference. So you get the same amount of subsidy into a 2 bedroom as into a 3 bedroom.
Kath?
Just to say that when family-sized homes are delivered in the social sector, one can control who goes into those homes and ensure that it is actually a family that occupies them. But when they're for market sale, even though the planners call them family homes and, you know, require them so that they will have supply for local families, there's no way of controlling who actually moves into those homes, and the cost of a 3 or 4 bedroom new home is really out of reach for most London families on typical incomes. And what we see when we look at those homes is that they're very often occupied by single people sharing.
Okay. I'm going to come back to something that you said a moment ago, Rickardo, which you said all areas of London, you want to make sure that all areas of London are delivering their fair share. What does that mean?
So I think the current status of the housing market would dictate that in zones 1 and 2, say, prime London market, there has been a fall in house prices, and investors have stepped away. And the point I was trying to make, linked to that, is around land availability. And what we're seeing through our own programs is there are greater opportunities to acquire land more cheaply in outer London boroughs, and certainly through our strategic housing land assessment exercise that informed the numbers that went into the London plan, would certainly dictate that there are more opportunities in outer London. Given the transport links that we have in London and so on, I think it would be fair, based on the analysis, to suggest that a more balanced delivery of housing across London would be of greater benefit. So that was the point I was trying to make, really.
But you also said it needs to be the right housing in the right location.
Yeah.
A third point to that would be supported by the right infrastructure, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. Okay. Absolutely. It's not a singular.
Because you've just talked about transport links in London. I would invite you to come to my constituency and have a look at the transport links.
I live in Bexley.
Splendid. So you know exactly what I'm talking about. You and I could be drinking buddies. We can discuss this later. So, as you know, there are no tube stations in Bexley. There are none in Bromley either. And the bus links are better than they were when I was a child, but they're not great. So the possibility of building lots of high-density developments there, you could do it, but you're not connecting it to anything properly. What do you say to that?
So, I'm not a transport expert, so won't go into great detail there. But ironically, links into London from areas like Bexley are quite good.
Yeah.
It's just linkages between certain areas within the borough that are quite tricky. So, any conversation about investment into housing, of course, there has to be a discussion about infrastructure, physical infrastructure, social infrastructure, and so on. So, I'm not going to say that, we need to solely invest in housing in isolation and deliver numbers. It is also about placemaking.
Okay. Right, we're going to move on and talk about the Mayor's housing strategy and where he is targeting in his housing strategy. And leading off on that is going to be Assemblymember Pigeon.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring a couple of my own questions just ahead, just following on from the discussion and talking about investment. Actually, Kath made the point that when it's socially rented family housing, you can make sure it is for families, but when it's privately sold, and that's what I'd picked up, it might have been one of these sessions from the LLDC, the Olympic Park, the family housing there is going to young professionals buying it together or renting it from a private landlord. They're not getting the families in, but who necessarily with a family would want to live high rise. It's not necessarily an option for people. But one of the issues is that is large housing in parts of London that you may only have one person living in, somebody who brought up their family. Now, City Hall runs the Seaside and Country Home Scheme, moves about 150 families a year to properties outside London, people who want to perhaps give up their home where they live to move out to be near where their children are and others. Has City Hall considered investing more in that scheme, investing in building other properties outside London in locations where people want to move to? Because part of the problem is the Seaside and Country Home stock isn't always where people want to move to now. you probably get more bang for your buck outside of London. You then free up those larger properties that could go to families and help with overcrowding. Is that something either Rickardo through your team or Francesca through your policy team have been looking at?
It's not something that we've looked at in any great detail in recent times, but, you know, point is noted. I don't know if you want to add to that. No, not at this stage.
So nobody looks at this, but this is such an underrated scheme, and lots of people want to move out to be near family. And, you know, when you look at the map, you know, people in Southwark, Lewisham, they all want to move out to Kent, Harrow, it's the boroughs outside there and so on. It's looking at that as a way that you could increase the right sort of supply, but actually then free up some of those larger properties in London boroughs where there's a need. I don't understand why you wouldn't have looked at this.
Most housing associations will have some kind of under-occupation incentive scheme. It won't necessarily involve moving, you know, localities, but it will involve an incentive to move to a smaller property. There's and those are financed from within our own resources. There is a question as to whether the amounts of money involved, which is typically a cash payment, are really sufficient to persuade someone out of a family home and into a smaller home. And we have had some success in a county town almost building bespoke accommodation for people in very high quality flexi-care schemes, which has persuaded them out of family homes. That's all in the social housing sector. In the private sector, if you persuaded someone to move to the seaside and that home was being sold in the private sector, it might well be bought again by house sharers. Why wouldn't it? So in the social sector, you still have that sort of element of control that you won't have in the private sector.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking in the social sector, but it seems to me that there are people who perhaps living in 4 or 5 bedroom street property who don't want to move to the 1 bedroom property on the estate, but actually the finances make sense, and that might be a way to free up larger properties at possibly lower cost. It's a surprise is something City Hall hasn't looked at.
We don't have the data in front of us, but we could certainly look at the kind of number of people on the waiting list and return to you.
Yeah, I mean, I've had a briefing from that particular team, so I am aware of it. I'm just surprised you're not in that. But that's just one way I was just thinking if we're talking about a range of things. Let me move on to the questions I've got before me. Perhaps, first of all, to Francesca and Riccardo. Which group of people are each of the Mayor's affordable housing products aiming to help?
Sure. So I think it's a mixture. So for social rented housing, we would see that as being aimed at the people on lowest incomes, the people that local authorities have accepted are in the most acute housing needs. For the intermediate products, so that would be currently London living rent and shared ownership. We recognise that there are kind of large, probably quite swathes of the London population who struggle to rent privately or to afford in the private market. So I think why each individual household may seek to access a London living rent or a shared ownership property will probably vary on a case-by-case basis. I would expect that to vary by geographic locality. I think, you know, shared ownership in Barking and Dagenham looks quite different to shared ownership in Islington, but I think what we seek to recognise through the Affordable Homes programme is that for people at the lowest incomes, it's, you know, very hard to participate in the London housing market, but also for people further up the income spectrum, it's equally challenging, but in perhaps a different way.
Okay, so the shared ownership product you talked about, or intermediate, is that aimed at helping people who are currently homeless, or private renters suffering from the worst affordability? Is it aimed at them? Or are you saying it's by a borough basis?
It wouldn't be aimed at people who are homeless, because I think it would be more likely to be aimed at people who are renting privately, who are seeking to take a step onto the property ladder.
Okay, Helen, you want to
It's aimed at working households on low to middle incomes. Right. And yeah, I mean, it's a familiar problem with shared ownership, that some of the shared ownership homes actually are, ironically, considering our earlier conversation, the larger shared ownership homes are only accessible to people on what appear to be relatively high incomes, although they still fall within the you know, regulatory constraints of who they can be sold to. So, for example, a 3-bedroom shared ownership in Canary Wharf will only be accessible to a household with an income of between 80 and 90,000. That's still a legitimate target according to the regulatory framework, but you know, it's not within most people's estimation of a low and middle income household.
But the average shared ownership income is much lower than
much lower, yeah, because those are extreme examples of high value homes.
Is there a case, I mean, to the whole panel, is there a strong case for more investment, large investment in this area, intermediate and shared ownership housing? Helen?
I mean, I think, first of all, I think it's a perfectly legitimate thing to be doing for a housing association. I think it's meeting a real and, you know, increasing need. I think that there are issues around shared ownership which would benefit from greater debate, including, you know, the parameters of incomes at which it is aimed. I'm personally a very strong supporter of the London living rent tenure, and the reason for that is, first of all, the overwhelming demand for it. Secondly, the equalising nature of it, because what it does is it makes potential home ownership, low-cost home ownership, available to those households who don't have access to the bank of mum and dad, or who don't have access somehow or other to a substantial deposit. And I think that's the root of the overwhelming demand, is that it's a much more level playing field for people. I think providing intermediate housing is really important, even though housing associations, you know, originated as providing homes for people on the lowest incomes. We also aim to create mixed communities, we want economically viable communities, and we also don't want to stigmatise social housing as only being about the very poorest people in our communities. We want it to be, you know, a wide-ranging provision for lots of different people.
Okay. Yes, and that's Rickardo.
So, yeah, I agree with Ellen's position, but I think, you know, there is scope to expand you know, the intermediate rented sector, certainly through the London Living Rent product, and for there to be more sort of flexible type products that enable people to, you know, certainly make those savings and transition into ownership, either shared ownership or the private rented sector, or the sort of private purchase. And if the question is about the case for greater investment, certainly so, because with our London Living Rent product, for example, economically, as a product, it only works for the housing provider for a certain period, before they, you know, then have to either sell it on to the person who's currently renting it as a shared ownership property, or if they want to retain it for longer than a certain period, it requires a greater level of investment through subsidy or from their own resources. So I suppose, you know, the argument is, if there was a greater level of subsidy for housing providers to be able to let intermediate rented levels akin to London Living Rent in perpetuity, say, I think it would create a much more balanced offer.
Anyone else want to comment on this? No. Is the Mayor's 4.8 billion investment enough to solve London's housing affordability problems? Who would like to kick off with that?
I would say no. So the piece of analysis that Helen referred to earlier that we undertook collaboratively with members of the G15 aimed to build the most robust evidence base that we could, using a variety of both sector and government data sources for the amount of investment that would be needed to meet the targets set in the London plan. So that would be for 32,500 affordable homes per year, of which 70% of those should be for social rent, recognising the overwhelming need for social rent in the city. That analysis found that we needed, on average, from 2022 to 2032, so there is some inflationary impact within that, because that's obviously 3 years away from where we are now, but that found that we needed an average of £4.9 billion investment per year to deliver the 32,500 affordable homes that we need, which is a 600% increase compared to the current settlement that the Mayor holds.
4.9 billion a year, you're saying, is needed?
On average, between 2022 and 2032. So a portion of that is the inflationary impact between 2019 and 2022. But the greater part reflects that over the last decade, the costs of construction have diverged quite significantly from the revenues that are generated from letting low-cost rented homes, which leaves a quite significant subsidy gap on every unit and that 4.9 billion accounts for the fact that you can secure affordable homes from private developers through the planning system, and it also accounts for the fact that the social housing providers can develop homes for market sale which generate cross-subsidy. So even once accounting for quite ambitious levels of cross-subsidy and homes secured through the planning system, the level that we think still needs to be filled by government public subsidy is £4.9 billion.
Just interested in Ian's view on that.
Whether the 4.8 is sufficient.
Yeah, and also what Francesca's just said about
4.9,
because that 4.8 is over 4 years, and the ask now is 4.9 billion a year up to 22-23 in order to drive up the supply of affordable housing. And I'm interested in your take, bearing in mind earlier comments.
So I think I mean, as I say, you've really only got two levers that can materially affect the affordability challenge, and one is the provision of affordable housing of various forms, and the other is the kind of benefit system and leaving it to the private sector. And I think you can do either. The scale, I'm not au fait with what the scale of provision of social housing of various forms would need to be in order to get the affordability rates that Kath talked across to the capital. But obviously it's going to have an impact in terms of raising the proportion of people who aren't devoting such high proportions of income to renting. But I think it's important to bear in mind that solving or getting close to solving the affordability challenge, it's hard to imagine, I think, it being done with either the levers of affordable housing alone or local housing allowance. I think you probably have to pull on both levers because there's always going to be a significant number of low-income families in the private rented sector, and if we sort of ignore them and just tackle the social rented sector shortage, then I think we'd be only addressing half of the problem.
Kath, do you have a view?
I agree with that, and just to make the point that even if production of new affordable homes were massively scaled up, the vast majority of the London housing stock will still be the existing housing stock. The marginal effect will still be small.
Okay. Sorry, some of the pigeon I interrupted you.
No, that's fine. I mean, my only other sort of general point is should the Mayor either be investing or supporting more large-scale investment in private rented sector. So, getting institutional investors to invest in building private blocks for sale, for rent rather, but long-term rents, secure, tenancies and so on over 5-10 years. This is what other cities do. Actually, a block's just been built at Canary Wharf, which aims to do that. I'm just wondering, is that something? I think Barking and Dagenham told me they'd done it as a council, that sort of thing, because actually not everyone will want to buy or be able to buy, but actually knowing you've got this flat for 5, 10, whatever years, as long as you're a good tenant at a reasonable level, surely that's what other cities do. Is that not something the Mayor should be supporting, encouraging, investing in?
Sure. So we are able to invest through our affordable homes programme into that type of provision. I think it's the purpose-built private rented sector delivery. It's still very much an immature market, even though we've been talking about it in this country for the last 10 or 15 years. But I think it's only in recent years where the large, particularly North American firms have moved over and are delivering quite an impressive product across the city. But clearly now through planning policy, the Mayor has defined discounted market rent. We've aligned that planning policy to our funding programme. So if the proposals are brought forward, then we are able to invest in those homes.
You could.
We could.
You could. So it just seems to me, you've got all these pension funds and stuff investing in transport, well, why don't invest in purpose-built housing that helps those people who are never going to qualify for social, but actually means they can live in an area for many years, make it their home. and have a reason to work. Because around the world, people rent, as you said earlier, Kath. People in Germany, it's just the norm. You rent, you don't own. So actually, it's changing the mindset as well a bit.
Absolutely, and I think there have been certainly over the last few years some really productive, constructive discussions with pension funds.
Oh, good.
Certainly with officers in housing and those pension funds. But I think because of the certain other asset classes that they're used to investing in, certainly in the UK, I think housing. Some pension funds have been doing it for years, but I think housing's relatively new. So it's been a bit of an education. And sometimes where we may be putting subsidy into a development that a pension fund or a private institutional investor is also investing in, quite often, certainly the returns that are being sought don't necessarily comply or align with what we're seeking in terms of value for money. So it's a nuanced discussion, but certainly, where proposals do come forward to us that meet certain parameters, we're more than happy to consider and invest in them.
It might be interesting if you've got some examples around London that you could write to us so we're aware.
We'll see.
Thank you.
Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so question for Francesca and Riccardo. There seems to be a mismatch between the needs identified in the SHMA for social rentals and the conditions for grant approval. So is this leading to a smaller number of social rental starts?
So I'll kick off and then you can. So I think the £4.82 billion programme that is we're currently running, the initial tranche of that negotiated with government of 3.15 billion back in 2016. The terms under which that funding was received meant that it was predominantly geared towards investment in sort of shared ownership and intermediate provision. Through ongoing negotiation with government, we managed to secure the additional 1.7 or whatever it is to bring us to the programme as it is now. And part of that negotiation was to enable us to channel more of that investment into delivery of social rent, London affordable rent. So I think we are playing catch up, and there is an absolute need to, within the parameters of the programme, to seek to invest in a range of affordable tenures, more so a balanced programme, including more London affordable rent and social rent. But it's just important to set out that context of the journey since we've negotiated the programme from 2016 up until now. Francesca, do you want to?
So you mean you've managed to get more funding for social rent?
And that's reflected in the council housing programme, the £1 billion that we've managed to allocate to councils at the end of last year.
Mm-hmm. Does the Mayor have firm targets for social rentals?
We do not have firm targets for social rental homes. We do, though, seek to, when proposals are brought to us, we do, though, seek to fund a balanced programme. So with our strategic partners, for example, there is a conversation within the economic context of their programme and the numbers that they're able to deliver through cross-subsidy from private sales and so on, that they do seek to deliver as balanced a programme as possible. But I think, again, going back to the context and how the conditions around the funding that we've secured from government, we were starting from a very low base. And, with the development cycle, schemes having to go through the planning process from acquisition of land being roughly 3 to 5 years, it takes time for that to filter through.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just we heard from Helen earlier about the issues around shared ownership and the importance of the London living rent tenure. So do you think, will the Mayor get some clear targets for social rentals, or do you think you're just going to...
So when you say get clear targets, do you mean from in
for
discussion with government or self-imposed?
Self-imposed for London, what's the Mayor wanting to achieve in terms of proper social rent homes?
Yeah, so I think I mean, I can't speak for what may come from the mayor at some point, but I can speak to the direction of travel in the fact that, you know, we've got a council building programme, and actually, as you know, market uncertainty has sort of worsened. You know, we've been in ongoing discussions with partners about, you know, where they had previously brought proposals forward for intermediate products that are such as shared ownership, relying on the sales market, that we can have a discussion about making additional funding available to convert those homes to, you know, social rent or London affordable rent. So, you know, that's just another angle to the approach that we've been taking.
Right. And is the mayor's funding being spent on net gains in social rented homes? You know, are the grants being used for replacement of existing affordable homes or to create new ones?
So both. So where estate regeneration projects, for example, come forward, yes, grant does go into the provision of resupply of homes that are being demolished. But estate regeneration, you know, that's a very specific example. It's quite a costly development in comparison to development on land not previously used for housing. So it's a slightly different approach that needs to be taken because of other challenges around repurchasing properties from leaseholders, moving, decanting social tenants. So in those specific examples, there's a recognition that you know, we do need to provide that subsidy for reprovision as well.
Yes, but I mean, are there figures of how many new homes there are versus replacement of existing homes?
Yes, so we could extrapolate and provide that information. So
could you?
As
That would be very helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you. And including a breakdown of how the grants have been used to provide those homes. Is that possible?
So it's very straightforward in terms of how we apply a tariff rate of grant depending on the tenure that's being delivered by the housing provider. So again, we can provide that or signpost you to that information.
Thank you. Now, my colleague Sian Berry investigated London's affordable housing and what's actually been built by the boroughs. And she discovered that boroughs are already well below the strategic target for affordable homes. How are you helping boroughs to bridge that gap?
So, you know, again, council building programme, enabling boroughs to undertake direct delivery on their own land. But part of that programme as well is about giving or providing boroughs with the opportunity to increase their capacity. So we had a £10 million revenue programme that boroughs could bid into to take on new staff to work on these programmes insofar as their direct delivery is concerned, but to also bid for funding to fund their planning activities, either through a new staff or master planning or plan making approaches. So I think in terms of direct intervention, we're providing grant funding, capital for the homes, but also a small element of revenue funding. Now, I think it's fair to say that, you know, that £10 million of funding could have been allocated twice over, given the shortfall and the deficits that boroughs are working to. But you know, it's the current state of play, unfortunately. In addition to that, where projects are referable to the mayor, you know, we have sought to simplify planning policy, setting the threshold for affordable housing, for example, and going back to what I alluded to earlier, defining discounted market rent as a legitimate intermediate product.
Thank you. And within the affordable homes in each scheme, are you aiming to significantly increase the number of homes at social rent?
So, on a scheme-by-scheme basis, you know, the point I alluded to earlier about, you know, deferring to local authorities, you know, to ensure that they are pushing partners, housing providers, to deliver the types of homes that they need. I think in a lot of cases, certainly from a funding perspective, you know, we are one step removed from that, because, you know, it starts to become a bit of a tricky situation if you're trying to fetter the planning process and those negotiations that may happen at local level. However, you know, when partners do bring proposals to us and programs of funding, we do try to push them as hard as possible to deliver balanced programs. But it's difficult to dictate at a regional level, you know, what is being delivered scheme by scheme. But I do know that a lot of boroughs, in terms of what they seek in their planning policy, in London certainly, do seek high levels of, whatever the affordable proportion is on a scheme, high levels of social rented.
And just finally, do you think that the Mayor's plans will deliver enough social rental properties?
In terms of the current
needs?
I think, so given the base given where we started, and notwithstanding what Francesca mentioned earlier about what we think is needed going forward to deliver the homes that we need, and and that a significant proportion of that needs to be social rented, I think it will be very challenging. I think you know, there needs to be a significant increase in the level of subsidy if we are to make a dramatic improvement or increase in the level of social rented housing. But it needs to be noted that, you know, we're working within the context of a funding package that has been negotiated with government, and the fact that, you know, through that we are required to deliver you know, a certain mix of tenures. So, I mean, it's a convoluted answer to your question, but I think it's not without its challenges.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, I've seen Assembly Members Hall and Eshalomi in that order.
And this will be quick. I mean, one of the things that we all constantly miffed about is the lack of targets all over the place, which makes it difficult to hold the Mayor to account. In the 2018 housing strategy, it didn't contain a target for proportion of affordable family homes compared to the 2014 strategy, which mandated this at 36%. So why wasn't there a target put in there?
Again, you know, there's a firm belief, and through developing the strategy, that it is for local authorities to determine the mix and types of affordable housing, including the size that is needed to provide homes for those who are on their waiting list and those who they've got a statutory duty to house. I think, you know, having a regional target for larger homes, you know, it's definitely a something at a regional level that all who are in the sector tasked with delivering affordable homes could work to. But again, there is a nuanced approach, and there needs to be power retained within local authorities to determine the types of homes that they believe is needed to house those that they're required to house.
Yes, but if you haven't got something to go towards, as you put it, I think, you know, if there's no target there, then there's nothing to hold anybody to account to for anything.
Well, again, you know, as I said, I think it's a fine line and a balance between the Mayor dictating and setting that regional policy and what local authority deem is necessary for them to develop and to push through the planning process, housing developers to deliver to house those who they're required to house through their statutory duty. I take your point, but
well, I'm glad you take my point, because I think it's a valid one. If the Mayor managed to do it in 2014, I do not understand why this Mayor can't manage to do it. And don't you think that not putting these targets in actually doesn't stop these developers building smaller and smaller?
Well, again, as I said, through our own investment programs, we do strive to push partners to deliver homes that meet a variety of needs, a variety of tenures, We recognise that there is a need for a greater level of social rented and general needs rented homes. We recognise that certainly in areas in London there's an acute need for larger homes. But again, you know, it's difficult to have that conversation at a regional level without it also happening at a granular sort of local level within local authorities. And again, you know, there is a lot of power in enabling and empowering local authorities to deliver what they think is needed at a local level.
I hear what you say, but all I do hear from, and I'm a councillor myself, is that there just are not enough of those homes being built. I'll leave it at that.
Can I, just to chip in on that, it's not addressed in the London housing strategy, but in the 2017 draft London plan, it does state that as part of their housing strategy functions, local authorities are required to have an understanding of housing needs in their areas and, along with their local housing register, provide evidence for the size of affordable homes that are needed with regard to the London-wide strategic housing market assessment, which identifies that 14% of low-cost rented homes in London should be for 3 or 4 beds, but it recognises that across that picture might look quite different in different boroughs and different areas of London. So kind of speaking to Riccardo's point that local authorities' discretion to respond to their local circumstances shouldn't be fettered by the mayor, but they are required to have some regard to it through the London plan.
Yeah, only 14% though, as you say.
There is also, to extend that argument, you could say that imposing housing targets at all shouldn't happen because different boroughs have different needs of new development, don't they? I mean, I'm not suggesting you should say that,
No.
but it would be a logical extension of the argument you just made for abolition of the family housing target.
Well, not necessarily, because I think, okay, there's a granular argument about, you know, the size of homes and types of homes, but I think broadly we're all agreed that we need to deliver more homes, more affordable homes. So, you know, I don't necessarily agree that that argument follows through in terms of delivery of more affordable homes.
Sure, but what is the point of a target anyway? So if you take Bexley, for example, where you live, a great place, obviously, the affordable housing target now has been set at around about 1,400, I can't remember the precise amount, but it is equivalent to the size of a housing zone that Bexley have been planning for some years, which also features the delivery of a primary school in it because it would be necessary for that number of affordable homes to be developed. But the thing is, under the housing targets that have been set, they've got to do that every year for 10 years, which would break all records. So the targets that are being imposed centrally on the boroughs, many of the boroughs are turning around and saying these simply aren't deliverable. But the targets are there anyway because the onus is to develop the increase of supply. So on the one hand, you're saying that we shouldn't have a target for affordable for family homes because the borough should have some discretion about what they need. And yet on the other hand, you're saying that they've still got to deliver this number of homes. So
Well,
we're having it both ways.
Well, I didn't say that there shouldn't be a target for 3-bed plus homes.
You said that it was important that the boroughs could have discretion over what they need locally.
No, I said it's important that the boroughs are empowered to deliver the proportion and types of homes that they deem to be necessary.
But not the number of homes.
No, but also the number of homes. Absolutely, the number of homes.
So there shouldn't be housing targets for boroughs.
Well, I didn't say that.
No, but
I think we're all agreed that, you know, there is an acute shortage of affordable homes. Hence, the targets that have been given to boroughs linked to an assessment of the land that is available in London within those areas. So
is it linked?
Sorry,
Is it linked? I mean, I've just used Bexley as an example. They would have to break all affordable home delivery targets, not just in 1 year, for 10 successive years to hit the target they've been given. I mean, how much of this is real? I mean, it's very easy to write a target and put it in a plan and say, there you are, we've solved that problem.
But it goes back to the point I made earlier. I think, yes, we do need targets because, you know, there is a housing crisis and there has been a shortage of delivery over a number of years, which has led us to where we are. However, you know, that delivery of housing needs to go hand in hand with delivery of improved infrastructure, social infrastructure and so on. You know, there needs to be a broader discussion about placemaking in all of this. And, you know, there are other investment programs, housing infrastructure fund and other funds that, you know, government have made available to deliver these things. But, you know, the basic premise of having a housing target is a recognition that, you know, over a number of years, there has been an undersupply of affordable housing. So I don't necessarily think that, you know, the argument of, you know, having a regional target, a London target for larger homes, follows through to, you know, and links to a target for delivery of affordable homes more generally.
But why not? I mean, you've got a regional target for the number of affordable homes you want to deliver across London, and you've broken it down by 32 different boroughs. The family homes target was a pan-London target, wasn't it? So 36% of homes delivered across the whole of London should aim to be 3 bedrooms or more. So that's less specific than the housing target that the Mayor is now following.
Okay, well, I mean, at the risk of repeating myself,
I think we're not having a meeting of minds. I think it's fair to say. Okay, fine. Assemblymember Eshalomi, and if you want to follow on into your main question after that.
Just going back to something you highlighted earlier in response to Assemblymember Russell, Rickardo, in terms of working with, you know, developers and not being able to mandate how much in terms of affordable homes they can put. Do you feel that there's a lot more that you and your team could be doing in terms of looking at the fact that a number of these developers, they always state that their developments won't be viable without the GLA grant? So in essence, they're receiving subsidy from the GLA, but yet they're not hitting those targets. Do you think there's a lot more that you could be doing to push them on that?
So I think there has been, and I haven't got the specific stat, but since the Mayor's move towards a planning policy, which set a threshold approach for delivery of affordable housing, I think there has been a net benefit in the increase in supply of increase in the proportion of affordable homes being brought forward on development sites. I think what we encourage through our programme is, so there are a number of different routes through which partners can access funding to increase the levels of affordable housing. One of which is a route which acts as an incentive to increase delivery of affordable housing to at least 40% on development sites, where if a development is consented for a level which is below the threshold of 35%, but the developer, working with the housing association or whoever the affordable housing provider is able to get to 40%, we can apply a tariff rate of grant to get them to that 40%. So I think there are certain measures within our programs, our investment programs, where we do offer that incentive. Where the challenge is once a developer has negotiated with a local authority and has secured a consent for a level of affordable housing, we're then, because we don't have a direct contractual relationship with those private developers who are in control of the sites, it then becomes very challenging to get them to take up the offer, unless it works for them economically and it works for the housing association. You're then trying to negotiate and increase that level after the fact, but that avenue is there, that route is there.
So in essence, from a layman's term and looking at emails or concerns I get from constituents where they see new developments going up and they follow through with the planning process with the local respective councils, so in my case, Lambeth and Southwark, I think they're feeling that maybe those discussions should be happening before you get to that contractual stage, especially when, again, we were talking about public subsidy in a term of millions of funding. In some cases, developers and housing associations purchasing land at a reduced cost, but we're still not hitting those targets.
So we do have, certainly for developments that applications that are referable to the Mayor, we already have those conversations. These are the larger strategic schemes. But for the schemes that aren't referable to the Mayor, we are relying on the relationships that we have with developers. We're relying on the relationships that our teams have with local authorities to make sure that we've got sight of what's coming through. And you know, where we do strive to be at the table as early as possible to have those conversations. But in those instances, we have to be careful that you know, the developers in conversations with the local authorities are being pushed to maximise the level of affordable housing they can deliver without subsidy, before we can start to have the conversation about what more can be done with the subsidy. So it's a delicate balance, but we do strive to be at the table as early as possible.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to move on to the final set of questions. And again, just looking at the delivery approach on the housing strategy. And this is a question to all of you. And maybe we could get Helen to start. So looking at the requirements in the percentage of new homes being built, and bearing in mind everything we've talked about previously, affordable versus shared rent, private rented versus intermediate rent, do you feel that some of those targets and the minimum requirements could be hampering the development of could be hampering the progress of new developments?
I don't think that they're hampering progress of new developments. What is the sort of most pervasive risk that housing associations are managing when committing to new developments at the moment is market conditions rather than targets being set. So, and the availability of funding and capacity and other calls on our resources. I mean, I actually think working in a strategic partnership with a programme and a clear set of objectives is really helpful because it frames what we're doing, you know, and it provides some parameters and clarity. But there are numerous other factors which are or may impact on our ability to meet those targets in the next few years. I'm not sure I'm fully answering your question.
Yeah, no, just if you didn't have the figure saying, you know, you have to provide at least 45%, 50% affordable housing, and then that you have the mix of, you know, affordable rent, London living rent, shared ownership. Do you feel that you look at the scale of the G15 and, you know, I think it's over 600,000 homes. Do you think that you and your colleagues could produce more housing at a quicker rate if you didn't have to work within the parameters of those minimum percentage targets?
You might produce more homes if you were an entirely commercial operator, but we are not-for-profit organisations with a social purpose whose objective is to provide low-cost housing. And at the moment, the tenure mix that we are working to is a product of the financial model. Yeah. I think pretty much without exception, maybe with the exception of the very diversified, very large organisations, the G15 would prefer to provide as much affordable rented housing as we possibly can. So that number is an outcome of the financial model, not an outcome of any kind of aspiration on our part. So actually, I think, you know, we're not commercial providers. Whether we could build 1,000 homes for sale rather than 800 homes with 400 for affordable 10 years if we were purely commercial operators becomes irrelevant, because that's not what we're in the business to do, and that's not a constraining factor for us. But what is a constraining factor is the financial model and the dependence on the market cycle and other financial pressures which we are experiencing.
Kath?
Yeah. Well, I agree with Helen, and that having a clear framework is actually helpful in terms of reducing the risk that developers see when they're planning a new development. But of course, the percentage of affordable housing and the split of different kinds of affordable housing is only one tiny part of the whole planning permission envelope. There are all kinds of other things that developers have to negotiate with local planning authorities, building heights and densities and daylight and all kinds of things. So even if you did away with the affordable housing requirements, there'd be still quite a big element of uncertainty around what the planning permission would enable. The other point is that Helen said, well, if hypothetically she represented private developers who could just go out and build lots of homes without this requirement for affordable housing, there might be more homes built. That, I think, is true, but it's also the case that private developers will develop homes at the rate that they can sell them. Mm-hmm. So even on a site that might have many thousands of homes eventually when it's all built out, generally the rule of thumb is that they'll only build 150 or 200 homes a year for sale, because that's all the market can absorb. So even if you did see more homes in a total quantum, it might take many years.
I guess the only observation I'd make is that You know, as I said before, you've got you can have a general supply lever to improve affordability, and as I say, I think that's all the evidence suggests that's a very weak influence on affordability. Or you can do things like build social housing. So if reducing the requirements to build affordable housing were to speed up market provision, the impact on aiding affordability in aggregate would be pretty small. So you'd be sacrificing a more effective lever for a less effective lever of general supply, which I don't think would further the goal of increasing the affordability of housing for Londoners.
I would say there was some research published, I can't remember if it was earlier this year or last year, by Jeff Mean as part of the Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence, which found that delivery of affordable housing was actually an accelerator of market sale delivery in the private market rather than kind of slowing it down, on the basis that the markets for social housing and the private sale market tend to be independent, and for an organisation, for developers having the kind of certainty about affordable homes where they're being built, for example, with public subsidy, can actually de-risk development and provide like a cash receipt earlier in the process.
That's a very good point, actually.
Richard, Francesca, in terms of the grants, my apologies, Riccardo, the grants provided to housing associations or private developers, what's the average size of those grants, and do you have the breakdown in tenure type? You might not have that information.
Yeah, so we do apply grant on a tariff basis, which is in our published funding guidance. We can certainly signpost you to that, but in summary, for a London affordable rented home, we grant fund at either 60k per home or 70k per home, depending on when that home is due to start on site. And for intermediate housing, so shared ownership or London living rent, the tariff rate is 28k per home or 38k per home, depending on, again, when that home starts on site.
So quite generous.
Well, in comparison to years gone by, it's actually not so generous at all, comparatively. I think that roughly accounts for somewhere between 10 and 15% of the cost of developing the home, whereas in years gone by, maybe 10 or so years ago, certainly before 2010, subsidy was somewhere in the region of 60 to 70% of the cost of building the home. 60.
Do you feel that some of the, in terms of the conditions set by the governments on funding, is that having an impact?
I think the funding environment is clearly appreciated and known by everyone. We recognise that there are certain constraints in the funding that we've secured. I alluded to it earlier in the tenures that we have to fund. I think a large part of it is, what funding is being made available to us and trying to optimise that as far as possible. But as has been discussed today, having more investment, more subsidy would not only help us to invest and deliver greater numbers of affordable housing, but it also it refocuses the sort of funding models for housing providers and housing associations. It de-risks development overall. But we have to recognise that we're working within certain funding constraints.
Okay, right. Thank you. That's all from me, Chair.
Okay, just to follow up on that last point, to you, Rickardo, are you confident that the Mayor's targets for delivering affordable housing are realistic?
So, target to...
So the £4.8 million, 4.82 million, billion, beg your pardon, that has been granted by government, part of the deal is that you have to agree to annual targets, which are normally a range between X and Y. Are you confident the Mayor is going to deliver everything he needs to deliver by the end of that funding period?
At present, the programme that we've allocated to would suggest that we are on course to deliver that target.
How have you measured that?
Sorry?
How have you measured that? Because you're supposed to deliver 116,000 by the end of the 4-year period.
Yeah.
And you've only delivered, you're halfway through it, and you've delivered 32% of it.
Yeah.
So you've got 2/3 undelivered, but half the amount of time left.
Yeah.
How are you on course to deliver it?
So, without getting into the detail of the development cycle, so we have allocated a significant proportion, not a significant proportion of the funding, we have allocated to projects capable of delivering over 100,000 or so starts to hit that target, and we are 3.5 years into the programme. We have strategic partnerships with most of the G15 who have committed to delivering a significant proportion of that target. We are also running, where we have unallocated funds, running a programme of continuous engagement with the market. So as and when either strategic partners or the housing associations or councils bring forward proposals, we are able to fund them. So, you know, as we speak, when I say that we are on course to hit that target, you know, that's what I'm basing it on. But clearly, you know, with the current market uncertainty in the environment and where we are in that regard, there are certain risks around that. But as we speak, you know, unless, you know, there's a significant fall in the market and the trend suggests that, you know, there has been a steady decline, but if there is a disorderly exit from the EU, for example, then clearly that will have a significant impact on our ability to hit that target. But as we speak,
in summary,
we're in a good position.
You think there's sufficient in the pipeline that you'll hit
Yeah.
the target? Okay. In each and every year of the annual target, there's a massive upsurge in every single time in the fourth quarter, which takes you just about over the bottom end of the spectrum that you have to hit. And that's been the pattern so far. And it looks like, from what you just said, the overall pattern will be that the entire programme, over the course of that, it will be the back end before the massive upsurge in delivery occurs. Why?
So that is a very good question, if I may say so, and has always been the pattern of delivery in previous programmes. I think it's linked to the development cycle and when partners acquire sites, working them through the planning process, ensuring that they've all got all the necessary consents to get the scheme off the ground when they start on site and when they complete. I haven't got more of a scientific answer more than that, but than to say that, you know, this has always been the pattern of delivery. You know, quite often a programme that we allocate to up front is very rarely the same programme of schemes that that we see towards the end of the programme. There are difficulties on different sites. Sites come in, sites fall out, land becomes available that wasn't there previously. It's more of a nuanced case, but, you know, through our continuous approach of monitoring delivery and continuing to making funding available for opportunities, that has just always been the pattern of delivery.
Because I think over the course of the entire programme, leaving aside annual targets, there would be a lot of, I think, validity in what you've just said, because it takes time to gear up, it takes time to buy sites, it takes time to get planning permissions through, it takes time to start developments. But the point is that in every single year of this, we've seen a massive upsurge in the fourth quarter. To take one example, 2017-18, the bottom end of the target was 12,500 starts. And this was in the days when we were still getting starts delivered on a monthly basis. We were getting the figures. And at the end of February of 2018, you were about halfway through that. You'd done about 6,000 and a bit. And then by the end of the following month, you'd done as many in that 4-week period as you'd done in the previous 48 weeks. And sneaked over the line by 26. Then it turned out, in response to questioning from my colleague Andrew Boff, that literally 10%, 1,250 of those starts were starts from a previous year that had been restarted in that year. So can you see where I'm going with this, why we suddenly start getting a bit suspicious that something might not be as straightforward as it should be?
Yes, and you know, since then we have recognised the issue of restarts, and you know, in line with, you know, how statistics are managed and reported, we do go back and make those adjustments to ensure that over the programme period we are not double counting starts. In terms of and you know, we've been transparent there and have continued and will continue to report on those instances each year. I think going back to your point on the backloading of programs, you know, it is a nuanced argument. It may have, in addition to the points that I've already made, it may be linked to how providers let contracts and, you know, what targets are set for contractors and when they have to get a scheme on site or complete. But it has genuinely, certainly since I've been working in housing, not just at the GLA, but it has always been the pattern that programs are backloaded. It's not uncommon for, you know, 60 to 70% of our program to come in and to be logged in the last quarter or the last few months of the year.
Helen would probably be better placed to comment on this than me, but presumably there's also an incentive for housing associations or, you know, other developers who have their own kind of strategic plan and annual targets, and who will also report on the number of like homes that they've built each year to ensure that homes that could be delivered in Q4 rather than the first week of April or second week of April may also seek to do so. So it may be a product of the market rather than anything to do with GLA's intervention.
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of factors involved in this, and some of that is organisational psychology. So you will rush towards a year-end target, and things that have been, you know, being managed will be pushed much harder towards the second half of the year. I would say that the G15 this year have had quite a smooth set of delivery of starts, and in fact, in the fourth quarter, we'll start fewer than in the third quarter. So. But there's also a sort of, you know, how you wouldn't start from here. So in 2018, we were really pushing towards the end of a programme period, and there would have been, from our organisational perspective, a real push in the last half of 2018, and then a new programme starts. And so then you're sort of back to a baseline and building up from there.
Yeah. I mean, it's a complex thing. I mean, I'm perfectly willing to accept that. And of course, it is not the Mayor's fault that the grant funding period extends beyond the end of his term. It is what it is. Given the importance of housing, particularly the political importance of housing that's been attached to it by his administration, I have to say I'm slightly surprised that it is backloaded all the time, and that the overwhelming bulk of the programme won't be delivered within this term. I would have expected him to really gear up and motor by now, and that doesn't seem to be happening.
So, you know, again, and Helen, I'm sure, could corroborate this, our approach to strategic partnerships and enabling partners to draw funding early and more flexibly to allow them to acquire the sites that they need and take them through the planning pre-development process. You know, we believe we've allocated to a sufficient number of homes or sufficient number of projects as we speak to enable us to hit that target towards the end of the programme. But we are ramping up delivery significantly from where we were through the previous programme, the 11-15 programme, and the building the pipeline programme, for example. So, you know, there has been a massive scaling up from you know, quite a much lower base. Okay.
So, I mean, in this year, in the first quarter, there were 2,672 starts, and the bottom end of the range is 17,000 for this financial year. So there's going to have to be a massive step change, isn't there, between the first quarter and the end of the year if you're going to hit that number.
So I'm sure Helen will agree with what I'm about to say. And, you know, we have, you know, been undertaking intensive programme management, ongoing discussions with all of our partners to understand what all the risks are to delivery, not just on a scheme-by-scheme basis, but also at programme level with each partner. So again, you know, as we speak, you know, I certainly believe we're in a good position to hit the target this year. But again, it very much depends on external macro-political issues, which may certainly impact our ability to do so. But certainly, with the projects that are in the pipeline, I would certainly suggest that we're in a good position to hit that target. And again, just two other quick points. It's not uncommon for there to be quite a slow start to the year. And if you compare what we've delivered as a proportion of the target this financial year to Q1 in comparison to last year, I think last year Q1 outturn was something like 8% of the overall target, whereas this year at 2,672, I think that's about 16% proportionally of the 17,000. So, you know, we have been doing quite a lot of work with partners to see where we can influence local authorities to make decisions quicker, incentivise partners to bring projects forward as and when.
Okay.
I mean, sure. I mean, from the G15's perspective, I've been checking regularly back with all members how confident they are they will achieve the starts for this year, and there is I think I said to the Homes for Londoners board, there is a high degree of confidence that the starts for this year will be achieved in target. I think it's important to point out that developments coming forward currently are the product of decisions made some time ago, and so the fate of the programme in 21-22 is very dependent on predicting future market conditions, which is extremely difficult currently. And I think, you know, in support of the team, they are doing their best to support G15 members making economic decisions where we're trying to predict market conditions in very difficult circumstances. Because the homes that we're pushing the button on now will come to fruition in 21-22, and we will be trying to sell them in very certain circumstances. So, you know, that is where the risk comes in. The other aspect of risk, I think, currently for big housing association like ours programs is the potential cost of fire safety remediation works in tall buildings, which is unknown in quantity at the moment, but potentially, you know, extremely large.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable point. Okay, I've seen Assembly Members Hall and Eshalomi in that order, and then, unless there's anything else, I think we'll be done. So, Assembly Member Hall.
Okay, just very quickly, I mean, it is a shame that it's all backloaded all the time, because it's a problem that we need to fix. Just one small thing, in a 2016 document saying delivering your manifesto, TfL said that they would deliver 10,000 housing starts on their land during the Mayor's term. But this was watered down in the housing strategy, which now states that commitment as starting on sites 2021 with the potential to deliver those. Only 322 homes were started on TfL from 2016 to 19.
Okay, so is the question about specific where TfL have got to with their programme?
Well, I mean, clearly there's such a lag, and clearly what we're definitely going to do something now is watered down, and out of 10,000 homes, we're down to 322 having been started when you're looking at 10,000. Or you were promising 10,000.
So TfL are involved in a number of major sites that will yield significant numbers of homes. Clearly, it takes time through the pre-planning process to develop the proposals. These sites are quite often constrained, given that, you know, there might be a decommissioning of operational activity, for example, or they might be adjacent to sites with complex issues relating to adjacent landowners. I think if you're seeking more of a specific explanation as to how TfL are taking their programme forward, that question could be directed to them. And they do provide an update to every other Homes for Londoners board, which again is published and can absolutely share with you. But again, you know, my understanding is, as far as the most recent update, TfL is on course to achieve those 10,000 starts within the period proposed. So, you know, noting what has been achieved to date. But as I said, I think it's, in terms of context, it is worth noting that there are a significant number of large sites that will yield a significant number of homes that are in the pipeline, are going through the planning process and so on.
Okay, so just 322 so far, and you think that they'll deliver it. I mean, all of the things that you're saying are correct, but then they know that, so don't make a manifesto pledge to do something when you know that it might not be delivered. But
I didn't make that manifesto pledge.
Comment on that.
It's a point. It's a point.
Assembly Eshalomi.
It's fine, Chair.
Oh, okay. In which case, we've reached the end of our set period of questions. Can I thank our guests very much indeed for attending today and for their answers. Members, can we note the contents of today's discussion?
Noted.
We have a couple of items of business which we will rattle through, so if I could ask you to stay in your seats just for a couple more minutes, and then we will release you. Item 6 is the work programme for the committee. Can we note that?
Noted.
Item 7 is the date of the next meeting, which is scheduled to be Tuesday, the 26th of November at 10 o'clock in here. Item 8 is any other business that I consider to be urgent, and I'm accepting one item of business. Now, forgive me because I'm going to have to read a bit here. So, I'm accepting this item as urgent business in accordance with Section 100B 4B of the Local Government Act 1972 as amended, as there is a need to consider whether to request the material referred to within the report at the earliest opportunity. So item 8A of the agenda is a summons. So can I ask the committee to agree the following recommendations? That the committee, under the provisions of Section 61(1)(b) of the Greater London Authority 1999 Act as amended, requires 1. David Luntz, Interim Chief Executive, Old Oak and Park Royal Development Corporation, and 2. Liz Peace, CBE, Chair of the Old Oak and Park Royal Development Corporation, under Section 61(2)(a) and 61(2)(b) of the Greater London Authority Act 1999 as amended, to provide the Assembly with the following documents in their possession and or control relating to the Old Oak and Park Royal Development Corporations, that's the OPDC, Housing Infrastructure Fund, that's HIF, bid. The first one is the full OPDC HIF bid, including the 5-case business case, the conditions attached to the receipt of the £250 million HIF funding, the Old Oak North Business Plan, and the OPDC's assessment of the car giant stroke Arup alternative road alignment for Union Way, for which notice will be given in accordance with Section 62(3) of the Greater London Authority Act 1999, as amended, in due course, and with the documents to be provided no later than 2 weeks from the date of the notice requiring these documents. Members, will you agree that recommendation?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. There is no further business, so the meeting is now closed.
Thank you very much.
GLA Chamber Sound.